Everyone, it's Mark from Ripple Training. So this week, we've just released another new plugin for Final Cut Pro. This one's called RT Arrows, and it consists of dozens of animated, highly customizable arrows like hand-drawn arrows, light streak arrows, precise arrows, stretchable arrows. They all have intuitive on-screen controls. They all have lots of parameters for adjusting them. They can all be tracked with Final Cut Pro's Object Tracker. And you can do things like add effects like drop shadow and masking. You can change the blend mode. You can distort them to fit your footage. They're super flexible. We're totally psyched about them. A big shout out to Tyler Stallman for mentioning that he'd really be interested in some RT arrows when he saw our last plugin in January, RT Markups. And of course, we thought, oh my God, everybody needs some animated arrows, so that's why we made these. Today on MacBreak Studio, what I want to do is take you behind the curtain a little bit and show you how to make your own animated arrow using motion in Final Cut Pro with a focus on usability in Final Cut Pro, which is what this is all about, is trying to make things in motion that the Final Cut Pro user can quickly and easily use, modify, and make work for them. Let's check it out. So when you want to create an animated arrow and you select Final Cut Pro in the project browser, you could create it as an effect, you could create it as a generator, or you could create it as a title. I prefer using a title for a couple of reasons. First of all, versus an effect, a Final Cut effect is always applied to a specific clip in Final Cut Pro, and you can't tell that it's applied just by looking at the timeline. You have to go and look in the inspector. So that's one reason I prefer a title over an effect. The other reason is a title is easy to apply across multiple clips, while an effect would have to be applied to each clip independently. So why not a generator? Well, the primary reason is that a generator is kind of tall in Final Cut Pro. It's as tall as a video clip, and we're going to be stacking on top of the video clips. And I prefer titles because they aren't as tall in Final Cut Pro as generators. We don't need the title part of it. We're just using a title because you can extend it over multiple clips and because it stacks nice and thin so you can stack them up. So I'll select a title. I'm going to use a 4K preset, 60 frames per second, and 5 seconds duration. This doesn't matter that much because all of these arrows are going to be vector-based, so you can scale them to any size. So it's not completely critical in terms of the resolution and also in terms of the duration. I try to choose something that for the user might make sense. 10 seconds is probably too long for most people for most of the time to have an animated arrow on the screen. You can always make it longer in Final Cut, but I like to try to use a default value that's close to what people might want to use most of the time. My whole orientation is how to make these useful and easy to use and fast to use in Final Cut Pro. So I'll click Open. Now in Final Cut Pro, we do not need this title, so I'll delete it. And I'm going to create a new group for our new elements. So Shift-Command-N for a new group. And then I'll select the paint stroke tool to draw our little animated arrow. I want it to look kind of hand-drawn. So I'm using the basic solid preset here. It's the default preset. And you can choose a width before you start drawing, and you can test that width here by drawing and clicking play to see what that looks like. Go a little bit wider than that. And I'll just draw a simple line, and I'm going to be a little rough because I want it to be hand-drawn, so I'll kind of make it a little not completely straight, just something like that. We can't see it yet, but if we scrub through, there's my arrow. I don't really like the thickness or kind of the way it's arranged, but it's really easy to adjust. So I'll select the first part of it, then I'll increase its width. And I prefer to work in the inspector most of the time here than the heads-up display. So I'll go to the inspector for this one. That way I can set the width specifically to match the other one at 82. And I'll reposition this a little bit. I'll rotate and reposition this a little bit. And quickly we've got a little animated arrow. Now, I don't like the way it animates on. It's animating on based on how I recorded it. And I really want to think about how the Final Cut Pro user is going to use this. And I want to make this adjustable. So a couple things I'm going to do here. I'll start with the bottom one, which is the stem of the arrow. So let's call it stem. And let's call this top one arrowhead. And for the stem, I'm going to select the write-on behavior that's automatically added when you draw with the paint tool. By default, the speed is set to recorded. I'm going to change that to custom. And I'm going to use the pop-up menu here to reset the custom speed parameter, which will get rid of all of those keyframes in there, because I want to do this manually. The other thing I'm going to do is extend this write-on to the end of the project. So I'll move the playhead to the end and press O. Now nothing's animated for the stem because we need to set a couple of keyframes. So for the custom speed, I'll set it to 0 here. I'm not going to worry too much about the timing yet. I'm going to set it to 100% here. And then towards the end, I'll set another keyframe and then go to the end and set it back to 0. And now that stem animates on, and at the end it animates off. Great, let's do the same with the other one. We'll change it from recorded to custom. We'll reset it. Our play's at the beginning, so I'll set a keyframe. I'll move forward and set it to 100%. Extend this right onto the end of the project, move towards the end. Another keyframe at 100%, go to the end, and another keyframe at 0. So the whole thing animates on and animates off. And let's adjust the timing a little bit. Let's say we want the stem to come on first to about there. And then I'll select both these keyframes by holding down the Shift key and drag them out. Maybe move this one a little bit closer. So the stem animates on, and then the arrowhead animates on. And I might want to do the same thing at the end. I'll have the arrowhead animate off first. Move those back. And let's actually play through it. So it animates on, animates off. Great. The other thing I might want to do, it's hand-drawn, but it's a little bit too rough for my taste. So I'll select the arrowhead. I'm going to right-click on it and choose Edit Points. And you can see it's added a lot of points when you use a paint stroke tool. So I might just delete a few of those so it's not quite so rough. I'll hold down Spacebar Command and drag to go in close. And maybe I'll delete this one as well. And this one. Shift Z will fit us back to the normal view. I can move these a little bit. I'll select the stem and delete one or two there. I want it to be hand-drawn, and sometimes this control point thing gets in the way. You might have to zoom in a little bit, but there we go. Shift S to go back to the regular tool. Okay, another thing I want to point out to you is if we look, for instance, at the stem, it writes on to the right, and then when it writes off, it goes backwards again. Now, what if you didn't want to do that? What if you wanted to write off in the same direction? This is a little extra tip here. So what I'm going to do for the stem, instead of draw, I'm going to choose draw and erase. And by default, it's going to just, boom, come up and disappear right away. But what we can do is use these jump to keyframe buttons to go to that second keyframe. Instead of 100%, I'll type 50%, which means it's drawing on. I'll jump to the second to last keyframe, set that to 50 as well, and then jump to the very last keyframe and set that to 100. So now, let me just turn off the arrowhead a minute. We can focus on the stem. So now that draws on to the right and draws off in the same basic direction that it drew on. So just an option for you. And by the way, with our RT arrows, you could always open these up in motion and adjust these if you wanted to. So that's all great. But in Final Cut Pro, you want to be able to trim this title, this arrow. You want to make it last longer or shorter, but you don't want this animation timing to change necessarily. So when the user in Final Cut Pro would make this, let's say, 10 seconds long or 6 seconds or 2 seconds, you want to be able to protect this area of the incoming and outgoing animation. So we're going to use markers for that. So I'm going to move playhead quite a bit beyond these initial keyframes. I'll show you why in a minute. I'm going to press Shift M and then Option Command M to add a marker and open it up. I'm going to choose Build-in Optional. And I'll show you that in a minute too. Then I'm going to move well before the outgoing animation starts, Shift M, Option Command M, and choose Build Out Optional. And the reason I'm choosing optional is so if we go to the project and we look at what's published, it automatically publishes these. If I didn't choose optional, it wouldn't be published. So Final Cut Pro, you can choose whether or not this animation happens. Frequently, I don't necessarily use the outgoing animation because the arrow's on for a second or two, and I just want a hard cut. So what you can do in Final Cut Pro is turn off, for instance, the build out, and then that won't animate out. While we're here, I'll press Shift-M for another project marker, Option-Command-M to open it, and I'll set this up as a poster frame marker, so that will be the thumbnail, which you don't have to do, but it makes sure you won't get a thumbnail showing where this isn't fully animated on. Great. Now, what else do we want to be able to control in Final Cut Pro? Everything's oriented about how you can make it easy and flexible to use in Final Cut Pro. And the first thing I think about is color. I'd want to be able to change the color. So I could select each of these, and we have a brush color. We can test it, like, okay, I can see that. We could publish these independently, and then the Final Cut user could change them independently. But my feeling is most of the time, they probably want this all to change color together. So what I'm going to do is link these colors together and just publish one of them. So let's use the stem, and for its brush color, I'm going to choose Add Parameter Behavior, Link. And then I'm going to drag the arrowhead into this well, and because they're both shapes, it understands that I probably want to link the same parameter. So now it's linked those colors together. So if I select the arrowhead color and we change its brush color, they both change. Great. So what I'm going to do then is choose from the pop-up menu here to publish just that brush color. I'll go to the project, and in the project inspector, these are our published parameters. I'll change the name. Brush color doesn't make a lot of sense, so I'll just call it color. These are all the parameters that will show up in Final Cut Pro, and I can test it, and indeed, it works as expected. Fantastic. What else would we want to change? Well, maybe the width of each of these strokes, and maybe you wanted those independently. So for the stem, for the width, I can test it, and I'll publish it. And then for the arrowhead, for the width, I'll publish that. If I go back to the project, we see they're both called width. Let's be more specific. So let's call this stem width, and let's call this arrowhead width. Okay, so now the user can choose whether or not it animates on or off, change the color, and adjust the width. But what about, really importantly, they might want to change where it is on the screen, how big it is, and they might want to rotate it. So position, rotation, and scale. Well, we put all of these two separate paint strokes in their own group so that we can easily manipulate that group. I can move it, I can scale it, I'll hold on Shift and Option, and I can rotate it. And I can do that directly on the screen or in the Properties tab in the inspector. Here we have position, rotation, and scale. So we could publish each of those parameters directly, and that would be fine, but it forces the Final Cut Pro user to adjust those parameters in the title inspector. But I want to make it easy. I want to put an on-screen control in Final Cut Pro so the user can drag, just like I can do in Motion here. I can drag right on it to adjust position, rotation, and scale. I want the Final Cut Pro user to be able to do that as well. So what we're going to do is create an on-screen control. And for that, I'm going to create a new group, Shift-Command-N, and then I'm going to add into that group, if I go to the library, to generators, and to generators here, I'm just going to add a color solid. It really doesn't matter the object in here. I just want something that's the full size of the group. I'm actually going to disable it so we don't see it. This is just something that's going to hold our on-screen control. And for the on-screen control, we're going to use a filter. So I'm going to choose Filters, go to Distortion, and choose Twirl. And the reason I'm using this is because this on-screen control for the twirl filter includes a object here, which we could use for position. It includes a little dial here, which you could choose for rotation, and we could use this here for scale. So we can use position, rotation, and scale all from this one filter. I don't want the filter to actually do anything. So in the inspector, I'm going to push its mix down to 0. And I'm also going to publish the on-screen control so this shows up in Final Cut Pro. So now it'll show up, but it won't actually do anything. If we move it around, it's not doing anything. So we need to link it up to this arrow. Let's call this group here for the arrow. Let's just call it arrow. So I want to connect the position, rotation, and scale of this group to the twirl. Now you need to know what's what here. So amount is this guy here. So that's what we want to hook up to scale. So what I'm going to do is choose the group and go to scale. Now I need to do this separately for scale X and scale Y. So for scale X, I'll choose add parameter behavior link. And I'll name it just link SX for scale X. And then I'm going to drag in the color solid to the well, choose the filter, twirl. We said we wanted it to be amount. And it immediately does what looks kind of a crazy thing, but that's okay. We can use this amount offset slider to get that arrow back to its original size. So I'll just set that at 1. Now for scale Y, instead of doing the same thing, let's just link scale Y to scale X, so they both change by the same amount. So back in the Properties tab, we can see a little gear icon next to scale X indicating it's now being controlled by behavior. So for scale Y, we'll add a link behavior. And we'll link scale Y to scale X. So I'll drag the arrow group into the well, go to Properties, Transform, Scale. We want to link scale Y to scale X, so I'll select scale X. And now scale X and scale Y will change by the same amount when we change scale X. So now if I select the twirl filter and I drag on this outer ring, we can see that the arrow is changing size as I drag it. It's not changing fast enough though. So what we want to do there is adjust for this link behavior its own scale value down here for linking the scale to the twirl amount. What scale means here is when you make a change to the original parameter, how much this will change by. And you can kind of go back and forth with this. I found the best result I got for this was to crank this up to about 10 and then move the amount offset back to 0. If I do that and go back and select the twirl again, we can see we now get a better relationship between the size of that diameter of that circle and the arrow itself. So let's hook up position to this part here. So what is that? What's being controlled there? So if we look at twirl, there's a center value, and that's what that is. So what we'll do is select the arrow group, go to position, and we need to do X and Y separately here. So for X, add parameter behavior, link. I'll call this link PX. And we'll link it to the color solid, to the filter attached to the color solid, to the twirl, to the center, and to X. It immediately jumps over. This is just something you need to know about. We need to set that X offset to minus 0.5 to recenter it. And then we'll do the same thing for position Y. Add parameter behavior, link PY, link it to the color solid, to the filter, twirl, center, Y, offset, minus 0.5. Super. So now if I select the twirl and I drag that center control, we can move the arrow around. Finally, let's deal with rotation, and that would be this twirl value. So select the arrow group, rotation, let's open it up. We want rotation Z specifically. We'll add the link behavior, call this link rotation Z. Add in our color solid, select our filter, twirl, and choose twirl. Immediately rotates. Let's select the twirl and see how that works. Not bad, but again, I think we need to adjust the scale here. So I'll select the rotation RZ parameter, and let's try a value of something like 5. Then I'll select the twirl. And now that is more of a better correspondence, and I'll set it to its starting position about there. Great, so now we've linked up position, rotation, and scale to this filter, so we have a nice on-screen control for Final Cut Pro. Okay, so the last thing I want to do here is to give the Final Cut Pro user the ability to change how quickly this animates on. I don't care as much about animating off because I just want that to happen very quickly, and people aren't going to really look at that, but you really might want to animate it on at different speeds. The animation speed is determined by the location of these keyframes. Now, we could select each write-on behavior, and for its custom speed, you could publish this directly to Final Cut Pro. But doing so would force the Final Cut Pro user to manually set their own keyframes to create different speeds. They would get the most control that way because they could pretty much do any speed as long as they don't place those keyframes beyond these markers here. Remember, these two markers determine the part that will be stretched or trimmed in Final Cut Pro. and these opening and closing animations won't change. They won't really know where that is, and it just takes more work. So what I want to do is make it easier for the Final Cut Pro user. So I'm going to create a little rig that gives them 3 speed options. So what I'll do from the object menu is I'm going to choose a new rig. And what I'm doing here, instead of publishing parameters directly, I'm connecting these parameters to a rig and publishing that rig. My rig is going to be what's called a pop-up widget. So I'll select the pop-up. I'm going to rename it here and call it Draw on Speed. And you can see it changes its name here and here as well. It has snapshots, and there's no values attached to it yet. So what we're going to do is rename these snapshots. I'll rename the first one to slow. Then I'll make one called medium. And I'll go to the last one and rename it as fast. You don't need to have 3. You could have 1. It doesn't make sense to have 1 on a pop-up menu, but you could have 2, or you could have more by clicking the plus button, add as many as you want. Now what I'm going to do is, with slow selected, is the way I'm going to add the parameters I want to change to this is I'm going to choose start for the edit mode. And it says we're in rig edit mode. So anything I do now is going to be tied to this specific state of the widget, slow. So I'm going to make a slower animation. And this is why I put these build in and build out markers further out here to give me more space. So I'm going to take this right on for the arrowhead and have it go right up to that marker, move this over here, and then move this keyframe over here. So now I have a slower right on animation, and I'll stop the rig edit mode. And those values, you can see each of those right on keyframe values have now been added to this, what's called a widget here in the rig. So let's now go to medium, and I don't need to start the rig edit mode anymore. Once these are linked up, I can make changes and they'll be associated with the state medium. And you can see, in fact, they went back to their original values that I had before I made a change. And I think that already works pretty well as medium. So I'm going to jump right to fast, and then I'll adjust each of these keyframes to have the stem right on much more quickly and have the head right on much more quickly. And now that's much faster. So now if I go back to medium, we can see those keyframes jump. And when I go back to slow, they jump again. Let's say we want to use medium as the default value, and then I need to publish this rig. So again, instead of publishing these parameters directly, I'm publishing this rig. So now if I go to my project in the project pane, there's our draw on speed. Let's move it up above the color, and I'll just command click so we get rid of that outline. It doesn't really matter. And there we have pretty much a fully rigged animated arrow that will be easy to modify in Final Cut Pro, because all of these published parameters will be available to the user, and they'll have a nice on-screen control to quickly adjust position, rotation, and scale. As always, we'd love to know what you think about our content, so please leave a comment below. If you like this stuff, subscribe, hit the bell. We'll see you next time here at MacBreak Studio.